Hello everybody, and welcome to the Drydock episode 318. This week the questions are taken from guide 392 on the unbuilt Austro-Hungarian battleship designs of World War I, the video on HMS Diamantina, still preserved up there in Brisbane, Australia, and the Friday video on using lasers to preserve museum ships. So let's begin. User Rifle Hyquil, I think, asks, the place where I work uses a former Essex class's steam turbine to power process equipment. How common is this? Are there parts of ships that have been scrapped that live on in some random factory or plant? Bits of machinery from ships that have been scrapped having a second life in civilian use is relatively common, but usually on a much smaller scale. There are, of course, the big obvious ones like the Jodrell Bank telescope using Revenge-class turret traversed gear to move it around, and some of the turret mechanisms and fire control mechanisms for 5-inch guns were used to track early NASA space launches, and to be honest, may still be used for that purpose. But something like using an Essex class's steam turbine as a power source, that is somewhat rarer. Largely on the basis of the big bits from a warship when it's being scrapped, like, say, the boilers or the steam turbines, are usually lifetime expired or close to. One of the biggest reasons for decommissioning a warship, at least without any other pressing needs, is the fact that it's approaching its machinery lifetime expiration date, and then you're faced with a situation of, well, do you want to rip apart pretty much most of the ship to get at the machinery to take it out to replace it to essentially then rebuild a good chunk of the ship and put it back into service, bearing in mind that when the machinery runs out of user life it's probably a fairly old ship, or do you just scrap the ship? Now these days, with ships being a little bit more lightly built, that's a little bit more of an interesting choice, especially because of course ships these days are beginning to resemble some Age of Sail ships in that they're being expected to be in service for considerably longer than the ages of most of the crew. But back in the time period that Channel covers, which is obviously the bit I'm addressing, that was a lot less common. Plus, of course, those ships have various armoured decks, including the Essexes, in this case their hangar deck, and that makes things exponentially more difficult to cut through. And so by the time you get access to some of the big machinery from a warship, as I said, it's usually pretty useless. The Essex class, however, I can see there being some exceptions to that because, of course, some of the Essexes were launched right towards the end or just after the Second World War, so they have little to no wartime steaming on them, which tends to run their mileage down a lot faster. And then they were in reserve for significant portions of the Cold War, and thus when they eventually went to the scrapyard as being obsolete due to the massive expansion in size of US carriers, they wouldn't have had lifetime expired machinery, and thus a turbine like the one you describe would potentially be available. And of course there's a lot of stuff on warships that is only applicable to warships, fire control systems, on a carrier's case steam catapults and so forth. But there are quite a lot of smaller parts of ships that have been scrapped that will live on. Generally the day-to-day machinery that has multiple uses, ice cream machines, galley equipment, machine shop tools, gauges, valves, that kind of thing, they will definitely find themselves a place in civilian life because they're relatively easy to remove. Even things like damage control pumps, they're usually replaced on a fairly regular basis, so the chances of them being lifetime expired at the time the ship goes to scrapping are fairly rare, and unless the Navy has taken them for repurposing on other ships, the scrapping company is probably going to make an awful lot more money by reselling them than they would just getting the scrap metal value for them. BK Zhang asks, the current notoriety of Yamato as the supposed symbol of the Imperial Japanese Navy, whether it be in a positive or a negative light, is in stark contrast to how she was actually viewed during the war as a result of most Japanese civilians not knowing of her existence, with Nagato being the true symbol of the Japanese Navy all the way to the Japanese surrender. In your view, how has Yamato suddenly becoming famous and often being incorrectly assumed to have historically been iconic affected our understanding of both the ship herself and World War II naval history in general? I think a lot of it depends on which aspect of history we're looking at, because if we're looking at World War II naval history as it relates to the Japanese people, as it relates to the general civilian makeup of things, then obviously having an ahistorical view of just how much the Japanese people knew about Yamato and Musashi, let alone valued them, will affect things. Conversely, if we're looking at it from a purely tactical and strategic view, as in the campaigns and what the Japanese Admiralty, who of course knew exactly what Yamato and Musashi were, how that pans out and how that affects things, then whether or not the ship has post-war notoriety or not really doesn't make too many odds, because the ship existed, the Admiralty, the Japanese Admiralty that is, knew that they existed and how they wanted to use them, at least in theory, and the fact the Allies didn't quite know what they were like is also a factor that you have to play into. And perhaps that has a certain degree of civilian knowledge playing into it, because of course, unsurprisingly, in the 1930s, the vast majority of intelligence that was gathered on both sides was based on what civilians knew or could plausibly know in terms of deployments, what ships looked like, etc., etc. So if you keep it secret from the Japanese public, that massively cuts down on the number of people who could potentially pass information on to the United States, advertently or inadvertently, about the actual size and capabilities of the ship. But whether or not it was secret really doesn't actually affect the actual frontline issues surrounding the ship, both how it was used, how it wasn't used, how everybody reacted to it, etc. Much in the same way as the fact that nobody knew about Bletchley Park, apart from people who were, actively part of it until well into the Cold War. That doesn't actually change its effect on the war, albeit obviously it does perhaps affect the perceived way that the war was fought before the information about Bletchley Park came out. But I think there is a fair point to be raised in terms of perhaps the focus on Yamato and Musashi that has resulted from its post-war fame. Now, it's understandable why. They're the biggest battleships to ever put to sea. They're the most heavily armed, all the other, superlatives that are attached to the Yamato class. However, what you do tend to see quite a bit in a lot of literature is, as I said, perhaps an overt focus on the Yamatos, and to a certain extent potentially even in some histories of the war in the Pacific, because sometimes you'll see, they'll talk about the carriers, and then they'll talk about Yamato and Musashi, and the Nagatos, Kongos, and perhaps to a slightly more deserved extent, Fusos and Iseis, essentially get second shrift. They're sort of like, they're the older, obsolete ships of the Japanese Navy, but really, what were the Yamatos doing? This is what really affects how the war is going as far as surface ships go, whereas, obviously, as we know, the Yamatos were relatively rarely deployed. They were deployed to a number of operations. They weren't just sitting around at truck all war, but there were other Japanese capital ships that were significantly more active, particularly, of course, the Kongo class. A user whose name appears to be just a random collection of letters asks, why very few 3-2-2-3 main armament schemes? More guns per salvo compared to having 4 twins, while also allowing for half salvos of 5 guns as compared to trying to work out how to do half salvos from 3 triples. For reference, 3-2-2-3 is referring to the number of turrets and the guns in the turret, so essentially a Nevada type layout where you have a triple, then a superfiring twin, and then a superfiring twin, and then a triple at the aft end. Now, as for why so few of them, it essentially boils down to a couple of main factors. especially when you compare them to having 3 triples. Yes, you get an additional gun and a slightly more rational way of doing half salvos compared to 3 triples, but it means you need 4 magazines, 4 turrets, 4 sets of barbettes, and therefore you're going to take up more deck space, more hull volume, and more displacement to get your 3-2-2-3 layout as compared to 3 triples. Now, of course, you might say, well, of course, you're getting an extra gun for that. Yes, but proportionally, you're going to be spending a vastly greater amount of displacement, space, and also, since you have 2 super firing turrets, stability, than you would with 3 triples on a per gun basis. So it's a slightly less efficient layout from that perspective. Another factor is that when you see the inverse, a 2-3-3-2 layout, like you have on, say, the Pensacola's, that's because you are lacking beam fore and aft to fit a triple, which would be the ideal. Obviously, if you've got a 3-2-2-3, then you obviously already have the space to fit a triple because, well, you fitted a triple as far forward and as far aft as you're going to put the main armament. And at that point, well, why aren't you also fitting triples where your twins are? Now, yes, that will cost you slightly more stability and it will weigh slightly more, but the increase is going to be relatively marginal. I mean, yes, you're going to need a bigger hull, but again, cost and weight increases will be relatively marginal to give you 2 extra guns worth of firepower and commonality of maintenance, because, of course, everything from the layout of the faceplates to the way the internal mechanisms work, etc., is going to be slightly different in a twin versus a triple. Whereas if you had all triples, which is obviously what the US then moved to with the Pennsylvanias, then everything is near as makes no difference interchangeable. Now, to be fair, the 3-2-2-3 arrangement is more efficient than having 5 twins for 10 guns, which is of course what New York and Texas have. But you also have to look at it from 2 different aspects of battleship design. In the First World War, where you're trying to absolutely maximize firepower, then if you're upgrading from a previous design that was all twins, then the argument, as pretty much we covered earlier, is why not go to all triples? Now, with the Nevadas, and at some point I need to do a video on the detailed design history of the Nevadas, there are some legitimate reasons why they end up with twins and triples, primarily stability and space saving on a minimal size hull, because they are still constrained quite a bit by congressional funding. However, as we see with the Pennsylvanias and the further standards, they very, very much want to go over to all triples, because apart from anything else, whilst Nevada's layout is somewhat more efficient than Texas and New York's, it doesn't offer any actual increase in firepower. You still have 10 guns, albeit over slightly greater arcs than having an amidships turret. So if you actually want greater firepower and you're moving from an all-triple arrangement with 10 guns, then your solutions are either, if you're going to stay with the same caliber of gun, the 14-inch in this case, you move to an all-triple layout, which nets you 2 extra guns for 1 less turret, hence the US standards, or you go for 8 guns but of a substantially larger caliber, which allows you to retain the twin turrets, which are a little bit simpler and easier to maintain, hence in the US, the Colorados. And in the UK, you see the same thing from the Orions, King George V's and Iron Dukes with 10 13.5s in 5 twins, moving over to the Queen Elizabeths and Revengers, which go down to 8 guns with 15-inch caliber. So at that point, when you're looking at essentially your displacement is restricted only by how much your treasury is willing to pay, it's just about the firepower. And then if you skip forward to the treaty period and the treaty battleships in the 1930s, then the efficiency issues come into play, as we mentioned earlier again. So yes, you might get 1 extra gun out of having a 3-2-2-3 layout, but it's going to cost you a huge amount more in weight and stability as compared to 3 triples. And given the tight constraints on displacement and the fact you need every ton you can get for speed and armor as well, in that case going for 3 triples is preferable. Theodorus Alexis asks, a friend of mine is writing an alternate history story that involves a post-war Royal Navy still possessing battleships and battlecruisers. She wants to know if the UK were able to keep its capital ships, specifically the QEs, Nelsons, King George V's Vanguard and Renown, after World War II, all economic issues aside, what type of service life would they have had, and in your opinion, how much longer could they have potentially been in commission? Would their designs have allowed them to accommodate more modern equipment, engines, weapons, etc. that the Royal Navy would use in the future, or would they have gone the same way as the North Carolinas and South Dakotas? Well, one of the biggest issues is the economic issue. So if, as you said, we're hand-waving that, all economic issues aside, either the UK government massively reprioritises spending or finds some magic money tree or something, I don't know. Anyway, what potential do these ships have? Well, Nelson would need a massive refit. Rodney would even need an even more massive refit, and historically the government wasn't actually planning on keeping Rodney. But whatever the case, basically because Rodney was too worn out by the end of the war, but whatever the case, Nelson and Rodney, or just Nelson, would need a huge refit to make them compatible with post-World War II tactics and strategy. Apparently, at least according to Churchill, something was in the works for Nelson before financial considerations forced them to cancel that. And we know somewhat more definitively that there was something also in the works for Renown. Now, of those two, I would probably give Renown the greater potential going forward. She is the older vessel, to be sure, and of course she is the less well protected and the less well armed. However, in a post-World War II environment, especially in the late 40s and early 50s, when the successors to things like Fritz X are floating around, the amount of armour the ship carries is probably much less relevant, especially since, of course, the new likely opponent, Russia, doesn't have any capital ships. Renown is still more than protected enough to deal with Soviet cruisers, and she is baseline considerably faster, and because she's so much longer, she has considerably more deck area to play with when it comes to developing new technologies. And of course, the Royal Navy develops quite a number of its early missile weapons and so forth to be able to directly drop in and replace things like the Twin 4.5, the Twin 5.25, and the 40mm Bofors mounts. So of course, she has a bunch of those down the side. Those can be easily done. The flip side to all that, of course, is that the Nelsons, with their all-forward arrangement, do lend themselves slightly more, perhaps, to very early anti-aircraft weapons, because they don't have anything particularly substantial on the back beyond twin 6-inch turrets. So you could potentially make an argument that a Nelson-class refit could strip off all the secondary armament from the aft, and that aft area could become an early missile farm with perhaps missile magazines in place of the twin 6-inch magazines and swing arm launchers, as was the flavour of the day. And even if you want to go with what I tend to call the last remnants of the British space programme, aka Sea Slug, there's enough space on the aft of a Nelson class to install a full Sea Slug launcher assembly without affecting the main armament. Now, I'm not necessarily saying the main armament is colossally useful in whole. You still want to keep a couple of turrets at least, but removing an entire main turret battery plus all its barbette and magazines, etc., is hugely expensive and difficult and requires an awful lot more calculations as compared to stripping out and repurposing secondary. So the Nelsons, physically, probably better shaped for early missile technology. Renown, as a whole, probably better shape for future use from the older vessels, that is. Renown, probably better off, especially earlier on when you might just see twin 3-inch automatics coming in to replace all other secondary guns. The Nelsons would be in a bit of a pickle because although they're better placed for missile tech, they would need substantial engine refits and potentially even hull refits to get up to a decent speed, and you need them to essentially stay in almost a perpetual refit, a bit like Ark Royal was, the Audacious class that is, in order to get them to a point in history where missiles were actually available to stick on them. The QEs, unfortunately, I can't really see a huge future for them. They might be useful as training ships. You might have one of them turned into a test bed ship like the US did with the Mississippi, but they are the smallest, they are the oldest, and therefore they're also the most worn. Valiant's not in good shape, Warspite's not in good shape, Barham is sunk, Malaya has been used as a test bed already for, lobbing bombs at it, which basically means that QE is the only one that could even reasonably viably go forward, and as I said, should probably make a half-decent test bed. I can't see her having a huge post-war career, though. The King George V's and Vanguard, on the other hand, if you're going to keep the capital ships around, are probably best placed holding the line, at least maybe having Vanguard and a KGV around while the other KGVs stay in reserve and cycling them through, while you deal with your refits of Renown and Nelson. And then once Renown and Nelson and or Rodney come back onto the front line in the early to mid 1950s, then you can start looking at what you're going to do with the King George V's and Vanguard. Now, the King George V's do have a few flaws in their design. They're obviously built very tightly to 35,000-ton treaty standards. They have a relatively low bow. Now, you could correct a bunch of that, but you would have to perhaps rebuild the bow to a more Vanguard-style bow. And if at that point you were going to massively reconstruct the ship, then you might as well go whole hog. And bearing in mind this will be the mid to late 50s and everybody loves helicopters and early missiles, depending on your priority levels, you might either strip out the secondary battery and remove the twin turret in exchange for lots of missile launchers, so things like Seacat down the side and something big in place of the twin turret. Or you might keep the two forward turrets, obviously still take off the secondaries and replace them either with Seacat or twin 3-inch or a mixture of both, and maybe go in for removing the entire aft quad turret and for it using that freed up space and weight to probably put a helicopter deck on maybe one of those abominable box-shaped hangars, etc., etc. Vanguard, as your least worn ship, would probably go into refit last. And in an ideal world, you'd probably see her go through a partial refit in the mid to late 50s, which would perhaps strip out all 40 mils and the 5.25s and replace them with twin 3s. And that, in and of itself, might allow her to last long enough until something like, say, Sea Dart comes in, which could then replace the twin 3s. But this is all obviously incredibly optimistic because we're hand-waving the economic issues aside. If we were going to do a slightly milder version of that, where the government is prepared to put money into keeping battleships on the front line, but not an unlimited amount, then at that point, really, Vanguard and Renown become the two that are best kept around purely because of their speed and ability, therefore, to keep up with the carriers. Knowing some of the early Cold War British designs, Nelson might get repurposed as an experimental ballistic missile-carrying battleship instead of having its main battery. And you might see a King George V with a helicopter hangar strapped to its back as a form of amphibious assault vessel, but that's probably it. The rest will end up being scrapped or used as test beds. Warrant Officer Will asks, in Drydock 302, somebody asked about building totally not fleet destroyers, and you mentioned that it was for the most part possible, but might not be worth it. My question is, using hindsight, what easy upgrades would you go with if you were designing a frigate or destroyer escort in the interwar period? Okay, so with hindsight, I can think of a rather evil little scheme. Now, bearing in mind, this kind of ship would be possible to build en masse because it specifically somewhat abuses Article 8 of the London Naval Treaty, which specifies what ships are exempt from various limitations. And there's a reason why there's a sloop up on here, you'll see in a minute. So the main things that you have to bear in mind, we're looking at a naval surface combatant vessel that's going to exceed 600 tons but not exceed 2,000 tons. It's not allowed to have a gun above 6.1 inch in caliber. That's fine. We don't need it for a frigate or destroyer escort. It's not supposed to mount more than 4 guns above 3 inch in caliber. That's important. It's not supposed to be designed or fitted to launch torpedoes. Okay, fine. We can work with that. And it's not supposed to be designed for a speed greater than 20 knots. Important thing there. So what I would do at that point is design a supposed small escort, small anti-submarine escort, might even call it a sloop, although later on it will turn out to be a frigate or destroyer escort. Now, in order to get around these rules, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invent, if I don't have it already, a twin 3-inch mount with at least a full basic shield. Now I'm going to say that the shield is there for weather purposes, but all in all that's probably going to give me a mounting that's going to weigh in the order of 15 to 17 tons. And then what I'm going to do is either have 8 of these mounts, 2, 4, and then 1 aft and 1 amidships, or I'm going to have 6 mounts, 2, 4, 1 aft, and then a space in the middle, which I'll get to in a minute. Now, the reason I'm not going massively overboard with the guns mounted right aft is because this is supposed to be a sub-hunting ship, so I still need plenty of space right aft for depth charges and so forth. And the reason why I'm alternating between potentially having a 4-turret design or a 3-turret design is because the other option you could put in the middle just after the funnel would be a very basic aircraft launching facility. The argument being, at least at the time, what I would tell everybody is that this aircraft is there to help my little sloop, frigate, destroyer escort, whatever you want to call it, help it find and attack enemy submarines. Now, of course, as we know from trying to put aircraft on considerably larger Fletcher class destroyers, this is actually a really dumb idea and isn't going to work very well, but the whole point of it is as a disguise. If you think it's going to cause too many weight issues, etc., then of course you can ditch and just have a 4th twin 3-inch mounting. Doesn't really make much odds either way, but the aircraft option does give you a little bit more plausibility for the additional space you're putting in the middle of the hull to make the ships a little bit longer, and thus, once they're fitted with more power, able to do more than 20 knots, because what I would do is fit the whole thing up with either diesel or diesel electric drive and have that calibrated to a speed of about 20 knots, but with this big void space in the middle directly underneath either the 4th turret or the aircraft handling facility. If it's an aircraft handling facility, then of course I can say, well, this is for stores, this is for the air crew, this is for fuel, etc., etc. If it's just another 3-inch mount, then I suppose I could put some magazine space, but also I could say, well, these ships are going to be on long, boring convoy escort duties. I'm going to put a little entertainment, exercise, and relaxation space in for the crew. Now, of course, the actual point, because these are very lightly built ships, is that when the war breaks out, and I want to quickly upgrade them, the aircraft, they're going to go if they're still there, and if it's a twin mount there, then obviously that'll get lifted off as well. I now have very easy immediate access through probably only one set of deck plating to a big void space where I can immediately stick more diesel engines, providing more power, and of course the turbo generators would have been, if we were using diesel electric, would have been uprated anyway on the argument that, well, we might lose one, therefore we want any one generator to be able to handle the output of both existing diesel engines, because we probably go for a twin screw design, except now, of course, you've stuck a couple of extra diesel engines in, and now you can get loads more power, you've got the additional hull length, and you can definitely exceed 20 knots. You put the deck plating back in place, and instead of the aircraft or the 4th twin mount, you can immediately stick a set of torpedo launcher, or later on, I suppose, you might ditch that in favour of some 40mm anti-aircraft guns or something. And the specific advantage of having a 15 to 17 ton twin 3-inch is that if you want to keep it, you can, but if you don't want to keep it, you can also swap that out with, if you're British, a twin 4-inch, so you can have 3 twin 4s, or if you're American, you can swap that out quite neatly for 3 single 5-inch 38s. The Huskal asks, let's suppose the US entered World War I much earlier, such that USS Texas was actually present at the Battle of Jutland. How do you think she fares? And for added entertainment, let's make a young Ching Li her chief gunnery officer. Unfortunately, as brilliant as it might otherwise be, I think by 1916, Willis Lee only has 8 years of service, just about, under his belt. The chances of him being the chief gunnery officer are pretty remote, let's just say. However, on the wider scope of how would Texas do at Jutland, it's going to depend massively on two things. Firstly, how soon relative to the Battle of Jutland did Texas actually reach the Grand Fleet? Because one of the things that the Grand Fleet noted when 6th Battle Division arrived historically was that American gunnery was not up to Royal Navy standards, and they had to spend a while practicing. So obviously if she's shown up a week before, there's going to be problems. However, if the US, let's say, has entered the war in late 1915, and Texas arrived in the Grand Fleet in January, February 1916, and so she's had almost half a year to up her gunnery levels, then, okay, her gunnery is going to be pretty much solid. It then comes down almost entirely as to where exactly she is, because although the individual gunnery performance of ships did matter, a lot of the factor of which Royal Navy ships actually got to score hits on the Germans came down to where they were in the battle line. Ships at the extreme ends tended to have considerably less capability to fire on the Germans than the ships in the middle, either because of smoke or because there just weren't that many German ships in view, and if you're at the tail end of the line, you're actually too far away to see what was going on for a good chunk of time. However, there is a little bit of hope in this. When you look at the order of battle at Jutland, the 2nd Battle Squadron up front is very homogeneous. That seems to be where the Royal Navy is storing most of its 13.5-inch armed ships. And similarly, 1st Battle Squadron is mostly 12-inch ships, although they do have Marlborough with 13.5-inch guns and Revenge with 15-inch guns there, and that's the aftmost squadron. However, 4th Battle Squadron, which is in the middle and therefore gets the most active firing, and has Jellicoe and Iron Duke, as well as obviously Admiral Sturdy in charge of 4th Battle Squadron generally, that is perhaps where she'd be most likely to end up. Now, the reason I say that is 4th Division, okay, that's got a mixture of ships, mostly 12-inch ships with Ben Bowers, Sturdy's flagship. However, 3rd Division only actually has 3 ships in it. Technically, Iron Duke is at the head of 4th Battle Squadron, but as the flagship, she's not technically part of 4th Battle Squadron. So technically speaking, 3rd Division is 3 ships, although in practice there are 4 present. And the 3 ships are Royal Oak with 15-inch guns, Superb with 12-inch guns, and Canada, which is the only ship in the Royal Navy in the historical Battle of Jutland with 14-inch guns. So it's a complete mixture of a squadron anyway, and if you did factor in Iron Duke, then there's 13.5-inch guns, which make it even more confusing. And so, if Iron Duke is kind of hanging around with 4th Battle Squadron, but not technically part of it, the single best place to put Texas, assuming Texas is there on her own, is to round out 3rd Division, which then means at least it has 2 ships with 14-inch guns in it and 4 ships total, and Iron Duke is a truly independent flagship just happening to be in the area, which of course means that she will get basically front row seats for shelling the German capital ships, and if she's up to gunnery standards, to the standards of the rest of the Grand Fleet, then she's likely to score quite a number of good hits, and of course her fuses actually work. So there is a reasonable chance that between having 12 guns, decent gunnery, and working fuses, and a frontline seat for the initial action, Texas might actually do some serious damage to one or more German ships if she gets a few good hits in, possibly even crippling one. OO asks, whenever interwar cruiser design, and to a certain extent destroyers as well, are discussed, almost every navy seems to be deeply unhappy with the tonnage limits dished out by the 2 naval treaties. Was this because more politically minded people did the negotiation without consulting their naval design departments, or rather that the design of warships shifted too rapidly from what every country agreed were reasonable ship displacements? And if there were tonnage allowances for World War II ship design from the start on, would this, in your opinion, have led to even heavier ship designs in World War II? It's partially political, but mostly actually in this case warship design shifting too rapidly, because you've got to bear in mind that the treaty limits originally, as per Washington, were set with a very slight margin of growth based on what the latest and greatest cruisers under construction at that time were. Now, the political element of it is a little bit at fault for not realizing that if you set those limits, everyone was immediately going to start building to those limits rather than the vast majority of their cruiser fleet, which was below those limits. And, the will to set limits in such a way that excluded some earlier ships but grandfathered them in was there. I mean, look at the battleship limitation, 35,000 tons, but Hood is allowed to slide. Carrier limits set at 27,000 tons, but Akagi, Kaga, Lexington, and Saratoga are allowed to be converted, and all the shenanigans that go on with the Lexingtons. So there theoretically was the possibility of saying, actually, we're going to go with 8,000, 9,000, or maybe even 10,000 tons as an ultimate cruiser displacement, but perhaps they were going to limit it to 6 or 6.1 inch guns, except for, the Hawkins class and the Furutakas and so forth that are under construction. We'll let those go, but once they're done, that's it, pretty much like they did for the larger ships. But with that done, everyone is like, okay, right, we have to have 8-inch guns, because that's the biggest we're allowed, that's what everyone's going for. Unfortunately, while you could build a reasonably balanced World War I era cruiser with 8-inch guns on 10,000 tons, the problem was, as both gun technology became more advanced and other technologies started to become more relevant, you ran into problems, because if you were going to have 8, 9, or 10 8-inch guns, and you were going to have cruiser speeds, which were now 32, 33 knots or more, then suddenly you were left with not a huge amount of displacement for protection, and you needed a reasonable amount of protection to protect you against the new 8-inch guns. And this started to already be a problem, and then you have to factor in the increasing threat of aircraft. Now you need a secondary battery, a substantial secondary battery, and that takes up weight and stability and space and crew, which adds more weight and so forth. And then you've got more and more aerial recon being slapped on as well, and suddenly there is no actual realistic way of squaring the circle. A World War I era cruiser that might just need 28 to 30 knots, maybe 32 knots, and 5 or 6 7.5 or 8-inch guns and armor to protect against them. Yeah, that's possible on 10,000 tons. But up to 10 8-inch guns, plus torpedoes, plus aircraft, plus an anti-aircraft battery, plus night fighting equipment, etc., etc., and obviously much, much later down the line radar, and speed and protection, it's just no longer possible. And so you have to make some very heavy compromises. What are you prepared to let slide? Unless you're the French with Algeria. And that's why quite often I come back round to the Baltimore class, because essentially the Baltimore class is a well-balanced heavy cruiser design for the treaty era. It has 9 8-inch guns, it has decent armor, it has decent speed, it has good anti-aircraft battery, etc., etc. It has all the things you could want in a treaty cruiser. But then look at the displacement. That's the actual displacement you now need to have all those things in balance. William Sledge, or William Sledge possibly, asks, I'm not sure if this has already been asked before, but do you have any strong opinions on how naval vessels are depicted in fiction? That depends on essentially two factors. One, how recent is the movie? A modern movie I'm going to hold to much higher standards, because modern ship models for CGI purposes, etc., are relatively easy to get hold of. Back in the 50s and 60s, not so much. And the other thing is, how realistic are you claiming your movie to be? If you're not claiming your movie to be realistic at all, if it's just, a fun popcorn flick, I am prepared to give you far, far, far more slack. So, as you might guess from this screen cap, the movie Battleship, in part starring USS Missouri, is hilariously unrealistic. I mean, there are so many things. If you wanted to nitpick through it, just from a naval perspective, it will probably be a nitpicking session that lasts longer than the movie itself. The handbrake turn with the anchor chain being just one of those examples. However, as I said, it's supposed to be a fun action movie It's not supposed to be a serious, realistic depiction of naval combat. So whilst I can tick off all the various issues with it, I'm also not particularly bothered. I'm just happy to, give it a pass and say, yeah, it's fiction. There's a bunch of aliens around there. I don't really actually care that much. However, if the movie is one of those, okay, switch off your brain for a minute, we're talking about Fantasyland, but still makes a specific effort to go with something that is actually historically accurate as far as you can within the scope of the movie, then I will give the movie actually major props for that. So an example I've cited before is the World War I set Kingsman movie. Admittedly, naval elements don't play a huge role in there, but there you do see HMS Hampshire, and it is recognisably HMS Hampshire. Now, they didn't have to do that. They could have just used generic World War I era cruiser stand-in model here, but they actually went specifically to, they took the effort to hunt down a model that would look the part. So, extra props for them for doing that. And, this is a movie with a breakdancing Rasputin. They didn't have to do that. They had to do the breakdancing Rasputin, let me be clear. They didn't have to make Hampshire as realistic as she was. The only time I will have a strong opinion is when a movie is trying to portray itself as either historical or very strongly based on historical events, and then messes up the portrayal of historic vessels. This is one of the reasons why I hold the most recent Midway movie as a very, very low bar. Now, there are some very good things about that movie, like the exact placement and the modelling, or the placement of bombs on and the modelling of the Japanese aircraft carriers. This is good. If that was the standard they kept to, I would be singing its praises to a certain degree. But then on the flip side, you have the Mighty Morphin Congo class, which is capable of magically turning itself into a destroyer and back. Destroyers that have no guns but have forward-mounted torpedo launchers. You have the 9-ship Yamato class, which was apparently escorting the carriers at one point for no discernible reason. You have every battleship in Battleship Row being a Pennsylvania class, including the famous battleship USS Neosho. Yeah, the tanker. That's also a battleship. You have Arizona exploding in 3 different ways, none of which are actually historically accurate. USS Lexington magically becomes a Yorktown-class carrier, and so on and so on and so on. That's where I have serious objections. If you want to portray yourself as a historically accurate movie, actually be historically accurate. Paul from Chicago asks, how did the 4-inch shells on HMS Belfast get to the guns? I was recently on Belfast and this wasn't very clear to me. So on Belfast and Edinburgh specifically, because of course they are slightly different from the other town class, the 4-inch magazine is forward, actually just underneath the forward part of where the aircraft launching facilities are. Well, pretty much under the aircraft launch facilities generally, actually. And you can see on this diagram where the 6 twin 4-inch guns are, so starting from roughly abreast the forward funnel to just as the quarterdeck is dropped down. In order to resupply them, obviously you have ready-use ammunition lockers right next to the guns, but a system that has not survived on Belfast as a museum ship but was present back in the Second World War was a conveyor belt system. So there were a pair of hoists from the 4-inch magazine, and they came up just at the aft end of the aircraft handling facilities, just forward of the forward funnel, i.e. just a little bit forward of the foremost of the twin 4-inch. And then there was a conveyor belt system, once the shells had come up on deck, that would run back. And it's supposed to be a 3-tiered conveyor system, obviously 1 tier for each gun mounting. And so the shells would come up from the 4-inch mount and they would be then run back, and the gun crews could collect them and then either take them directly to the guns if they'd exhausted the ammunition supplying the ready-use lockers, or they could keep stocking the ready-use lockers if there was a party emptying ammunition from them, but there was still some in the ready-use lockers, because then that doesn't disrupt the chain of events. So perhaps next time I go on Belfast, I'll hunt down where the 4-inch hoists are, and then I can show you where the conveyor belt system would have run but that depends on me getting to Belfast at some point soon. Vokir asks, would any of the German battlecruisers have been useful for interwar carrier or supercruiser conversions? Well, as I've mentioned previously, I think the Der Flinger and Hindenburg would have made excellent supercruiser conversions. They would have needed a bit of money to be put into it, but they have a good baseline. They've got excellent protection, they've got decent speed to start with, replacing that with modern machinery would help. They've got exactly the right kind of armament for a World War II era supercruiser, and either just sticking uprated machinery in, thanks to not needing really any much more in terms of armor upgrades, might buy you a bit more speed. Maybe you do a little bit about bow extension. Getting rid of the secondary battery to install a modern anti-aircraft battery might be a little bit more of a problem, but not something that's insurmountable. But in terms of carrier conversion, you've got 4 incomplete Mackensen-class hulls, 3 of which have been launched. They are about 40 feet longer by default than the Der Flingers. They're a couple of knots faster by design, and of course, being incomplete, you don't have to strip them down quite as much to convert them. So I would say if you're going to have an interwar carrier conversion from a German battlecruiser, you probably want to use 1 or more Mackensen-class hulls, because especially if you extend the flight deck over the bow and stern, as was typical for that period, and indeed is typical still now, you could probably get something that's pushing the size and scope of something like Kaga. Bearing in mind the Tosa-class battleships are not massively longer than the Mackensens as originally planned. You'd be faster than Kaga, especially once you've stripped off the obviously near useless main belt armor as far as carriers are concerned. And then you'd have a very high capacity, high speed carrier with a decent use case going forward. Seb Dove asks, a couple of years ago in a lecture given by Andrew Lambert as part of my war studies degree in the Experience of War module, he made a point that the German Navy in World War I was very much an army at sea, and the US Navy was much the same. He contrasted this with Seapower nations and how their navies operate, such as the Royal Navy. What are your thoughts on the idea of an army at sea, and what do you believe the impacts of this phenomenon to have been? Well, the whole thing of army at sea versus a sea power state is something you could write an entire book on, and indeed Andrew Lambert has written an entire book on it, which is actually worth a good read or listen to if you happen to like the audiobook version. Now, the general idea of an army at sea, at least in the concept that Professor Lambert puts forward, is essentially you've got 2 main aspects. The first is that it doesn't exist necessarily to control the sea. It exists to allow your nation, if you're the one with the army at sea, to control enough of the sea to deploy your army in order to effect whatever it is you want to change. So essentially it's a vehicle for delivering troops, and it's the land campaign that will actually enact the change that you want. Or by subtle variation, it may exist to prevent someone else from preventing your army from enacting the change that you want. The other aspect to it is that an army at sea is something that you can mobilize or demobilize, have or not have, and fundamentally, whilst it might affect your nation's overall standing in the world, it doesn't affect your nation's potential existence in the world. And that is very much the case with the German Navy in World War I. Although it doesn't strictly exist to convey the German army to other shores to do battle, it does exist to prevent the British Navy from interfering with the German army's operations in Europe. Ideally, preventing the British from getting there at all, but as it turns out, they can't stop that with the BEF going across the channel. But what they can do, by existing as a threat, is force the Royal Navy to not closely blockade the German coast and not conduct amphibious landings behind enemy lines, which is pretty much British nature of warfare from about as soon as Britain got a navy until pretty much the First World War. And of course, Germany, being a major continental land power, didn't need a large navy. It did need a navy, a coastal defense navy, which they acknowledged in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War, but fundamentally Germany's destiny, whether it was going to exist, its existential destiny, if you like, was always going to be decided on land. It could be a great power in Europe with its army. If it wanted to be a great power in the world, then it needed a navy, but no one was going to threaten Germany with lack of existence if it didn't have a big navy, because ultimately you'd have to invade it, and it had the big Prussian-based army to counter that, as compared to the UK, which is relatively small as far as European countries go land-wise, and depending on the period, potentially also population-wise. If Britain doesn't have a strong navy or strong naval protection, it suffers from a significant existential threat from somebody who can then come over and take over, like the French or the Spanish or whoever, because fundamentally, although Britain is quite a defensible place, it doesn't have the population base and therefore the army in order to actually fight a prolonged campaign on its own soil and still come out of it looking anything like the country that it was before. And to a certain extent, the US Navy is similar. It doesn't strictly need to have a navy in order to exist. It's got sufficient industry and sufficient population and sufficient territory that if the US Navy magicked itself out of existence at any point during the 20th or 21st centuries and was replaced by a much smaller coastal defense navy, although the US is standing as a global power would obviously be massively diminished because its ability to exert power elsewhere would be significantly reduced, the threat of the US ceasing to exist from somebody coming over and physically taking it hasn't really changed. It's negligible because, one, the logistics to carry any significant number of troops over to the continental US is pretty mind-boggling, and two, even if you did, you've got the entire industry of the continental United States and its rather large population who will be rather determined to make sure that your stay on the west or the east coast is a relatively short and violent one. The other element is that if you look at historically nations that tended to have more armies at sea rather than being sea power states, is that although they might amass more than one fleet, their general either single massive fleet or perhaps several smaller but still large fleets tend to concentrate in single packs with an expressed single purpose, whether that be the Spanish looking to transport large amounts of gold and silver from South and Central America, the Germans concentrating the high seas fleet to make the Royal Navy worried, and so on and so forth. Whereas sea power states, although they can concentrate their battle fleets in a single location for a big showdown, or concentrate a fleet for a specific purpose, in general, a sea power state's fleet deployments tend to be somewhat more diffuse because they tend to be trying to look after a much broader area, perhaps even the entire ocean, in terms of maintaining open trade, and obviously specifically maintaining open trade that somewhat favours them, but in more general terms, it's just the general open trade, because a sea power state benefits the most from open trade as a whole. And I think to a certain degree you can have some nations that exist in a little bit of a grey zone at times, in that their notional basis and their need for a fleet might be based more around an army at sea, and they might be enacting army at sea type policies, but also enacting some more sea power state policies. So take, for example, the US Navy in the Second World War. The US, as we discussed, doesn't strictly need a navy to exist. It needs a navy to place itself at the top of the totem pole of global powers. But those are two very different things. But in the Second World War, particularly if we look at the Pacific campaign, and even to a certain extent in the Atlantic, the US Navy is both conducting significant army at sea policies. To decide the war, it is trying to convey troops both first to take or retake various Pacific islands from Japan, and then eventually they're looking at, prior to the advent of the atomic bomb, they're looking at trying to invade Japan with Operations Olympic and Coronet. However, at the same time, at least once the Mark 14 torpedo is fixed, with the anti-shipping campaign and blockade against Japan using the submarines, that is much more of a sea power state activity to cut off the enemy trade, reduce their budget, reduce their shipping, and reduce their capability to fight, and eventually force them to either surrender or starve, which is more what the US was trending towards once they started recognizing just how many casualties would result from Olympic and Coronet. That is a more classical sea power state activity, because a sea power state will either not have or not want to sustain the army size and the casualties required for a major land invasion of a very determined land power, and so instead you just sit there and let them starve out until they surrender. So in that respect, you could look at the US Navy in World War II as conducting a little bit of both, although having its basis more in the army of sea at sea principle than the sea power state principle. How many Blackburns would a Blackburn burn if Blackburn could burn Blackburns asks, what kind of coastal defences did the British Isles have just before and developed during World War I against coastal raids by enemy troops and invasions, and are there any books or other resources that cover the topic in more depth? One of the best books you could probably pick up for this would be History of Coast Artillery in the British Army by Colonel Maurice Jones. Now, when you look at the state of British coastal defences in 1914, the start of World War I, what you'll notice is that there's quite a few of them in terms of modern coast defences, but in terms of the size of their gun batteries, as opposed to some other nations' coast defences like Germany or the States and so forth, they might seem a little bit small. In some areas, the heaviest gun to defend the coastline is a 6-inch gun, and in other more important areas, the biggest gun that's available as a coast defence gun is a 9.2-inch weapon. Now, the reasoning for this, and the various smaller guns as well, is essentially that you don't need anything larger, because if you are facing a threat where you need something heavier than a 9.2-inch gun, i.e. you're facing a capital ship invasion force, that's what the Royal Navy is for. Yes, theoretically, German ships can get to some elements of the British coast faster than the Royal Navy can, but if they're just there for a raid, then, well, you can do harassing fire with the smaller guns, and then the Navy will show up to drive them off. If they show up en masse to conduct an actual amphibious invasion, the Royal Navy is going to turn around and smash into them long before that's got anywhere close to being complete. And, of course, your 9.2 and 6-inch guns are going to be very useful against troop ships and so forth. And likewise, a 9.2-inch or 6-inch gun is perfectly adequate against raiding ships, i.e. destroyers, cruisers, armed merchant cruisers, that kind of thing. The battlecruisers that the Germans have throw things a little bit out of kilter because, of course, they are both fast enough to get to the British coast and heavily armed and armed enough to either ignore or win a fight with coastal defences of that kind of calibre. And they can get away before the Royal Navy can catch up with them, which is why you get the German battlecruiser raids on the British coast. But that's a little bit of something that the British hadn't really accounted for at the time. There's also a slightly older set of fortifications, although they're still pretty new, one of which I should be able to show you in an upcoming video before the end of the year, hopefully. But these were a series of forts that weren't necessarily coastal, they were more layered into the British landscape, and those had been built during the war scares of the 1890s and early 1900s, when it was feared that an invasion might actually be able to take place before the Royal Navy could respond adequately. And so they're less about defending the coast against German ships, they're more about holding key strategic points and killing a lot of infantry. Alan Smith asks, when someone is taking sounding with a lead, how do they know when they've hit the bottom, especially for very deep leads like HMS Challenger near Guam? Well, with an old-school sounding lead like this, the clue's in the name partially, sounding lead. It's a heavy lump of lead. You are essentially, with the old method, just looking for the lead being heavy enough to exert a noticeable tension on the rope that you're lowering, and when it hits the bottom, that tension goes away. So you also want to use a relatively light rope, and that's, you could have steel or iron or any number of things as your sounding lead, which is sometimes called sounding lead as well. But fundamentally, the difference in mass of a less dense material might make it difficult to tell when your line has gone slack. Whereas if you've got a really chunky, heavy thing at the end of the line, then when it hits the bottom, your line will go slack, and while it's still falling to the bottom, you should still have an amount of tension in your line. Now, of course, the more and more and more line you have attached, the more that line mass is relative to the sounding weight at the bottom. And so if you're really going to go deep, you need a even bigger weight, so you still get that contrast. But essentially, that's how it works old school. And finally, for this week, Tankax asks, during the First Battle of Guadalcanal, the Americans only knew about Hiei and Kirishima on the day of the battle. This, of course, caused any US heavy units to be too far away to make it into Iron Bottom Sound in time. Suppose that a lucky submarine or reconnaissance plane spots the Japanese force a day before, giving more time for the US Navy to react and put ships in position. How would this go? Would Lee be committed to the battle earlier than historically speaking? And if so, how would you see the result of this battle? Historically speaking, no, the US wouldn't have committed capital units to the battle. If they had a lot more time, a lot more notification that Congo-class battlecruisers were heading south, then they would have done what they would usually do in that kind of situation and try and hit them with as much air power as humanly possible, potentially, especially if there's a submarine spotting them, also a submarine try and torpedo them. And they might look to send in a significantly more powerful surface force, i.e. scrape a few more cruisers and destroyers from somewhere. But the US doctrine of the time held that sending capital ships into such confined waters was suicide because of the potential of being attacked by smaller torpedo-carrying craft like PT boats and destroyers. So US commanders on the scene almost certainly would have thought, perfect, the Japanese are committing suicide. Our PT boats and destroyers, as long as we send enough of them, will make short shrift of them. We don't want to send our capital ships in there because otherwise the reverse will happen. It was very much because of the utter draining of available US cruiser and destroyer forces in the area that Lee was allowed to go in at all later on. They just didn't have a choice anymore, and so they had to send in something, and the only something they had was Washington and South Dakota. Now, putting that aside, assuming that the US Navy was willing to go against its own doctrine at this stage, even though it still has a substantial cruiser and destroyer formation, and they send Washington and South Dakota in a day early or so, then you have a rather interesting scenario because, of course, the Japanese formation is disrupted and broken up by the fact they're running through a heavy weather front. If Lee, however, is in charge, and he has, let's say for making the argument somewhat easier, if he just has Callahan and Scott's force riding as escort without adding anything more into the equation, but he has Washington and South Dakota backstopping them, then he is likely to obviously have certainly a destroyer screen, possibly also a cruiser or two ahead, but he is much less likely to completely disregard radar returns the way that Callahan did, or come up with an especially complicated plan like Callahan did. And so what's more likely to happen is that either Lee on board Washington or one of his subordinate ships spots the Japanese coming on radar. Lee goes, that's very interesting, we should immediately deploy ourselves to engage in battle. And then you pretty much get a larger scale reenactment of what would happen when Lee and Washington and South Dakota actually deploy historically. You're admittedly unlikely to get as quite close range and ambush as you did against Kirishima when Washington took her out, partly because the Japanese forces are on much higher alert and there's much more ships for them to spot, including, of course, any outriding escort elements of Lee's force. However, once the battle actually starts to engage, Lee still has that radar-directed superb gunnery of his, which is probably going to cause significant casualties to the Japanese. Hiei is definitely gone. Kirishima possibly gone, depends how fast she can turn around and run. The main risk to all of this is that it is more confined waters. You do have a lot of rather odd radar returns, and you do have a lot more Japanese destroyers, etc., in the water at that point. So there is a higher risk that in the confusion of battle, potentially a few long lances might hit the US capital ships. But overall, in theory, if you roll the dice enough times, Lee's force should still have a decisive victory. It's just that problem of, well, as I said, there are enough torpedoes in the water. All it takes is the Japanese rolling one or two decent shots with their torpedoes, and while the tables might not necessarily be overall turned, you could end up with a crippled or sunk battleship or two on the US side. And that's it for this week, everyone. Thank you very much for listening, with the exception of a couple of quick announcements. So, my last visits for this year overseas, thank goodness, hopefully I'll do a little less travel next year, will be in this month, October, to Italy for a week, and then very briefly back to the US. So if you're in the US, I will be aboard USS New Jersey on Saturday the 26th for their Leyte Gulf commemoration event. So, come and visit the ship generally, and perhaps for that specific event as well. There's a huge slew of historians who are doing presentations there. Really, really good historians, and there's me. So if you want to meet a whole bunch of historians at the same time, definitely show up. And, well, you can fight me for first place in the autograph line as I get them to sign various books. And if you happen to be in Italy, I will be in Italy from the 13th to the 20th of October. And if you want to come and say hi, that's perfectly fine. On Monday the 14th, I will be at the Venice Museum, the Venice Naval Museum, or Museo Navale di Venezia, I think that's how it's pronounced. On Wednesday, I will be at the Vittoriale degli Italiani. Again, apologies, I think that's how it's pronounced, but it's near Genova. Then on Thursday the 17th, I will be at the Naval Museum in Genoa, the Museo del Mare. Again, I apologise, my Italian pronunciation is really terrible, but anyway, that's where I'll be. On Friday the 18th, I will be at the Naval and Technical Museum of La Spezia, obviously in La Spezia. Saturday the 19th, I will be at the Museo delle Navi Antiche di Pisa, which I think is the Museum of Naval Antiquity in Pisa, famous for the Leaning Tower and all that. And then on Sunday the 20th, I will be at the Nemi Ship Museum just south of Rome, and then I'll be flying out that night. So any Italian viewers, feel free to drop me a message on Discord or an email or something, and we can work out when and where to come and say hi, etc. And that's it for this week. Finally, thanks and bye-bye for now.